Hello and welcome. Today we're going to dive into a really fascinating story, one that's full of contrasts. It's the story of the Communist Party of India. Now just think about that for a second. A revolutionary idea born all the way over in Europe, somehow finding its place and growing within one of the largest democracies in the world. We're going to explore this whole journey, how they adapted, the struggles they faced, and the influence they came to have.
So that brings us to the big question we're trying to answer today. How on earth did this revolutionary idea, born so far away, manage to not just survive in India, but actually become a major force within its democracy? It's a pretty incredible political story, and we're going to break down exactly how it all unfolded.
All right, here's a quick look at what we'll cover. We'll start with where the idea came from, then see how they went from revolution to democracy. We'll look at the famous Kerala experiment, and then the big split in the party. After that, we'll talk about the key people behind it all, and finally, we'll wrap up with the legacy they left behind. Okay, let's get started with Section 1, an idea from abroad. You see, the beginnings of communism in India, well, they didn't start in India at all. The inspiration came from a huge political event happening a world away. So the first big domino to fall was way back in 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. That was the spark. It really got Indian thinkers excited because they saw this as a possible answer to being under colonial rule. Pretty soon, by the early 1920s, you start seeing these small communist groups popping up here and there. Then, in 1935, they made a really smart move. They decided to join the Indian National Congress, to work from the inside, to spread their ideas. But then came 1941, and a big disagreement. The communists decided to support the British in World War II. Their thinking was that fighting fascism across the world was the most important thing. But this put them in direct conflict with Indian nationalists, whose main goal was, of course, fighting the British to free India. Okay, so what was the core belief driving all this? It's something called Marxism-Leninism. Now, what does that actually mean? Let's break it down simply. It's basically built on a few big ideas. First, the idea of a class struggle, a constant conflict between the wealthy and the working class. Second, it calls for public ownership of resources. Things like factories and land should belong to everyone, not just a few private owners. And the end goal? To empower workers and peasants and build a society where no one gets exploited. Now, this whole ideology was about to face its biggest test yet, right after India became independent. The party found itself at a major crossroads. The country was brand new, and the big question was, could the party change with it? So, it's 1947. The British have left, and the Communist Party is asking a really deep question. Is this true freedom? Or did power just get handed over from one group of elites, the British, to another group of elites in India, with nothing really changing for the poor and the workers? And at first, they were pretty skeptical. They believed it was just a symbolic change. And this skepticism led to a really dramatic turning point. Before 1951, the party was all in on revolution. They called independence not real freedom, and even supported violent uprisings, like the big peasant rebellion in Telangana for land rights. But, that armed struggle didn't work out. It failed. And the party had a moment of realization. In this new democratic India, violence just wasn't the way forward. So, after 1951, they completely changed course. They chose democracy, they gave up the idea of revolution, and decided to fight elections instead. This was a massive shift, a move towards what we'd call democratic socialism. And this new path, well, it led to something pretty incredible. Something that made headlines not just in India, but around the world. Let's dive into our next section, the Kerala experiment. This was a truly historic moment. Their decision to try democracy, it paid off big time and really fast. In India's first ever general election in 1952, the CPI won 16 seats. Now just think about that. 16 seats might not sound like a lot, but it was enough to make them the largest opposition party in the whole country on their very first try. It was an absolutely stunning result, and it showed that their ideas weren't just some fringe belief. People across India were listening. And then 5 years later came 1957. This year was a game changer. In the state of Kerala, the Communist Party of India actually won the election. They formed the government. And the most important thing to remember here is that this wasn't a violent takeover. This was a win through voting, through the ballot box. It was, believe it or not, the world's first ever democratically elected communist government. And it was led by their chief minister, EMS Namboodiripad. So they won. They had the power. What did they do with it?
Well, they got to work right away, putting their ideas into action. They brought in some really radical land reforms to get rid of the old landlord system. They passed new education reforms to make sure more people could go to school. They set up social welfare programs for workers and the poorest sections of society. And they really tried to make the government more open and transparent.
But, as you can imagine, all these big changes didn't sit well with everyone. There was a huge backlash. The opposition, which included the Congress Party, powerful landlords, and even some religious groups who felt like they were losing control, they all came together and started a massive protest movement. It had a name, Vimochana Samaram. In English, that means the liberation struggle.
This whole struggle came to a head in 1959. The central government in Delhi, which was run by the Congress Party, decided to step in. They used a very powerful and, frankly, very controversial part of the Indian Constitution, Article 356. So what is Article 356? It basically gives the central government the power to fire a state government if they think things have gone completely wrong. And that's exactly what they did. They dismissed the Kerala government. It was one of the first times his power was ever used, and it's still debated to this day.
So the party had proved a huge point. They could win through elections. But even as they were dealing with these external fights, serious problems were brewing inside the party itself. And that brings us to our next section, a party divided, focusing on the big split that happened in 1964. Now, this split, it wasn't just about arguments over Indian politics. It was actually a mirror of a massive fight happening on the world stage. The two biggest communist powers, the Soviet Union and China, were no longer friends. They had huge disagreements about what communism should look like, and this global rift caused problems for communist parties all over the world, India included. So this big global fight literally split the Indian party in two. On one side, you had a group that stayed loyal to the Soviet Union's way of thinking. They kept the original party name, the CPI. But another group felt more connected to China's more revolutionary ideas. In 1964, they broke away and formed their own party called the Communist Party of India, Marxist, which you'll often see called the CPIM. And guess what? Both of these parties are still around and competing in Indian elections today.
Of course, a movement like this is nothing without its leaders, right? So let's move on to our next section and talk about the architects of the movement, the key people who really shaped communism in India.
Let's meet some of these giants. You had A.K. Gopalan, a very respected figure in parliament from Kerala. Then, of course, the man we've already mentioned, E.M.S. Namboodiripad, the very first communist chief minister. There's also S.A. Dange, who was there from the very beginning and was a huge leader for trade unions. P.C. Joshi was a key early leader, fantastic at organizing workers. Ajay Ghosh was so important in helping the party find its way after 1947. And P. Sundaraya, the incredible leader of that peasant movement in Telangana. These weren't just names. They were the people who built this entire movement.
All right, we're coming to our final section. Let's step back and look at the big picture. What is the lasting legacy of the CPI? What impact did it really have on Indian politics over the long run? When you look back, their influence is actually pretty huge. For one, they were pioneers in making things like workers' rights, land reform, and social equality part of the main national conversation. They also made Indian democracy stronger by being a very strong and clear opposition voice in parliament. And maybe their biggest contribution was showing everyone that you could fight for really radical change peacefully through democracy. By taking part in elections, they helped prove that India's multi-party system could work, that even very different ideas could have a place at the table. So that leaves us with one final thing to think about. When you look at the whole story of the CPI, from its revolutionary beginnings to winning elections to splitting apart, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What does this journey teach us about trying to bring about radical change inside a democracy? What are the real challenges, and what are the true possibilities when you try to change the system from within the system itself? It's a question worth thinking about. Thank you so much for joining me.